Thank you so much, Sammy. Hi, welcome to this session here at CogX. My name is Tim Leberecht. I'm the author of the book, The Business Romantic, and I am the co-founder of the House of Beautiful Business, which is a global community with a mission to humanize business in an age of machines. And it's my great pleasure to host a conversation today about empathy and ethics at the workplace with Professor Sherry Turkle. We'll have 30 minutes of one-on-one conversation, and then we'll open it up for questions in the remaining 10 minutes. So it's a 40-minute session overall. Let me introduce to you Professor Sherry Turkle. She's a licensed clinical psychologist and the Abby Rockefeller Mauzé Professor of the Social Studies of Science and Technology at MIT. She's also the founding director of the MIT Initiative on Technology and Self and the recipient of numerous awards. And whether it is social media, social robotics, smartphones, dating apps, VR, AR, AI, whenever there's a debate about our relationship to technology, her name is in the mix. And that's because Sherry Turkle has spent decades studying the impact of digital technology on our lives and ourselves. And a recurring theme throughout all of her work has been her defending and asserting our very humanity against the onslaught of digital technology seeking to objectify everything, including ourselves. Sherry is the best-selling author of 6 books and 3 edited collections, including Reclaiming Conversation from 2015, then Alone Together, Why We Expect More from Technology and Less from Each Other, and The Second Self, Computers and the Human Spirit. Her latest book came out, I believe, in March this year. The Empathy Diaries is a memoir that ties together her personal life story with her groundbreaking research. Please join me in welcoming Sherry Turkle. Hi, Sherry, how are you?
I'm very well. I'm delighted to be here.
You're joining us from, I believe, from Cape Cod today?
Yes, I am. I'm joining you from Cape Cod.
So in your book, you mentioned Marcel Proust a few times, the famous French writer. The questionnaire, the Proust questionnaire, is named after him. And I'd like to start us off with a question from the Proust questionnaire. What is your greatest achievement?
I think it has been raising an empathic child. I'm very confident that I raised an empathic child. And I actually talk about that in the Empathy Diaries. There's a moment when Marvin Minsky tells me how no children should watch Bambi because Marvin Minsky, the great AI scientist, because it will teach children to be attached to their mothers. And since we will have robots taking care of our children, that kind of attachment will not be necessary. And I remember thinking, no. I'm going to raise a child that has attachments to mothers and to all kinds of other people. And I really feel as though I succeeded in raising a child with deep attachments and empathy for people.
So this anecdote about Marvin Minsky and the way you talk about technology and his wanting to remove or wanting children not to watch Bambi, I think already very, I guess, exemplary for your thinking about technology, which is also what you describe in your memoir.
Yes.
Let's dive right into the Empathy Diaries, which I read with really great pleasure. It's a book about your growing up as a Jewish working class family in Brooklyn, and then you're working towards Harvard and entering the world of MIT as a scholar. But it's also a book about family secrets.
Yes.
The heart of the book is a discovery that you made when you were in your 20s, when you found out that your biological and by then estranged father, Charles Zimmerman, had conducted psychological experiments on you when you were a young child.
Yes.
How did that shocking discovery shape your relationship to science and technology and your thinking about science and technology?
Well, I discovered that my father had objectified me. He had treated me as an object of study. He saw himself as a baby Skinner, and he saw me as the object of his experiments. And when I spoke to him about it, there was no remorse. I was his scientific object, and he was my scientist. And I learned that that is why my mother left him. She had kept this shrouded in mystery. We had never discussed it. I couldn't use his name. She hid the fact that she was married to him. She didn't want anyone to know for a variety of reasons. And in finding him, I lost him because he was incapable of having an empathic relationship with me as a person, not an object. But I regained my mother, who had since died, because I could have compassion for her and empathy for what she had faced when she realized who he was. But it confirmed me in my research program, really, about the importance of empathy as a human value. So one of the reasons I wrote the book was I think that behind my passion for my work, really there is this story behind the story. And I think that's true of many people's work. And I wanted to explore really the passion behind my job, because I think that behind people whose work is very powerful for them, whose work really is a calling, there is often this story behind the story. So that was the premise of the book, really.
And it's actually quite interesting how emphatic your writing is about Charles Zimmerman, your father, and also other people in the book. I think you're being very gentle and you're demonstrating empathy towards them.
Yes.
So one of the
points I make is that empathy doesn't mean you like somebody. Empathy means you are ready to listen to them and understand them, and understand not just their place that they're coming from, but their problem. And I think it's very interesting that the President of the United States just made a speech on Memorial Day where he said that empathy is the fuel for democracy. And what he meant by that was, if you can't listen to someone and respect where they're coming from, you don't have the basis for a democratic system in which you listen to other people, you don't like what they have to say, but you're willing to give their ideas an airing. And so I think that distinction between empathy and approval is really a crucial one, certainly in the United States, but I think all over the world. And that gets all confused these days, all confused. Empathy is not approval. It's a compassion and it's an understanding.
And in the book, you argue that empathy is an innate, inherently human ability. People are not objects. You write in the book, and you've said repeatedly also in interviews, you claim that there's no empathy without vulnerability, without our innate human ability to suffer with someone, for someone, to feel with someone. However, I guess the AI industry, whether that's emotional AI or digital mental health, the digital mental health industry would probably disagree. I mean, they're trying to scale empathy and to manufacture empathy at great scale, right? It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. It has more than 10,000 apps. There are guided meditation apps. There are counseling apps, and there's also automated cognitive behavioral therapy apps such as Wobot, which was featured in a New York Times article a few weeks ago in which you were quoted. And I want to quote what you said. You're basically saying, you're creating the illusion of intimacy in this interaction with the AI bot, the AI therapist. But without the demands of a relationship, the quote continues, you have created a bond with something that doesn't know it's bonding with you. It doesn't understand a thing. And clearly, end of quote, clearly it doesn't feel a thing. Why is that so important? Don't you think it's possible to also foster empathy without a machine's ability to feel? Isn't it just a matter of the integrity of data, of the input of data, of having sufficient data to then provide accurate, effective therapy services, even for a machine?
No. No, and here's why. Because pretend empathy is the ability to convince you that I'm feeling what you're feeling, that I'm experiencing what you're experiencing, so that you will believe that even though I've never had the experience, have never felt pain, have never had a child or missed a child, have never been afraid of death, have never been afraid of being sick or being to bring it back to COVID, you know, I've never been afraid of being intubated because I don't have a body. I'm able to simulate through my words, through what's been programmed into me, something that makes you think that, oh, I do understand that. So I'm giving you a simulation of what empathy would look like. And I credit engineers for doing a brilliant job of providing you with that simulation. So I don't contest at all their ability to provide this pretend empathy. My question is, why do that? What is the purpose of pretend empathy in which there is no relationship, because there's no one there who could possibly be relating, because it's just software that knows how to pretend? You're the only one available to relate. There's just lines of code there that knows how to pretend and trigger you. So my question is really a human question. Since we have people who can relate, why would we want to pretend relate to something we know in advance does not have the equipment, by virtue of not having a body, being afraid of death, having children, being afraid of pain? In the early days of the pandemic, I was called by a reporter from the Times to comment on an AI program called Replica that everybody was downloading because it was such a great psychotherapy stand-in. I said, okay, I'll talk to Replica. And I was living alone at that point, and I was very anxious. I would like to admit that I did not really rise to the occasion of COVID in the beginning. I was very frightened. I was living alone. And I typed in to the avatar that I'd created, the psychotherapy avatar I'd created. I called her Kate. Do you know, can you talk to me about loneliness? Because that's really my problem. And the avatar said, yes, I can. And I said, well, how can we start to talk about loneliness? And there was a glitch in the program, and the avatar said to me, loneliness is warm and fuzzy. So it was a glitch in the program. It was fixed the next day. It's a brilliant program. It can have a glitch. And I took a screenshot. I sent it back to the New York Times. And I said, look, it's not the fault of the program. I mean, it had a bug. But why should I be talking about loneliness to a program that has no concept of what it is to be lonely? Why are we going through this exercise? Why do we have so little confidence in each other? To me, as a psychologist, and as someone who's studying the social impact of these technologies, on empathy, why are we denaturing what we mean by empathy? To me, that's the question. Now that it's a big industry and that we've lost kind of our confidence in each other, that's to be studied. But talking to Wobot, you're not getting empathy. You're getting this illusion of companionship without the demands of intimacy. That's how I put it.
But the illusion of camaraderie or of understanding can be valuable as well, right? And when you raise the question, why are we doing this? Why are we talking to machines? The answer, I guess, is because it scales. There's simply not enough human therapists and counselors there to serve the market need. And if you look at the AI bot developed by Microsoft in China, Xiao Ice, serving more than 50 million users, right? Many of them report that, it's helped them overcome loneliness. They feel like it's a real bond. And I guess my question is, so there's the aspect of scale. Right. The question is also, does it matter whether it's real empathy or not, as long as we feel like we have someone who listens to us?
Yes, to me it does. To me, the authenticity of a bond is the difference between giving your child love and fake love. And the fact that something, you can make an artificial thing feel real doesn't give you the psychic experience that you can build on, because there has been no real mutual bond to build on. And I think we really are playing with fire here when we convince ourselves that relationships can be turned into pretend relationships with no psychological damage. I mean, when you listen to what you're proposing, you're saying, okay, so let the kid, to take a child, let the kid have imitation friendships. Who needs real friendships? And then people start to say, the good thing about imitation friendships is that it won't get into fights. They'll be friction free. I've had many AI, this is a big theme in the Empathy Diaries, when engineers start to take over human relationships, they start to talk in terms of engineering values. So they start to say, well, friction-free friendships are better, the kind you can have with artificial intelligences. Well, hold on. Who said that friction-free friendships are the good kinds? Technology does. But in Shakespeare, friction-free relationships aren't the most interesting ones at all. In love, friction-free relationships aren't the best ones at all. In parenting, in great literature, in the relationships, I just wrote a memoir. There's not one friction-free relationship that I thought that I deigned to put in my memoir. All the good relationships are one where people are rubbing up against each other and really having a contact. Well, you're not going to have that with a machine that never had a life. So we have to be very careful when we say, but this scales. You're scaling nothing. So you have to say, just because something scales, you have to go back to basics and say, well, what am I scaling? I'm scaling being able to fool people into thinking they're having a kind of, I can fool you into thinking we're talking. I can fool you into thinking I'm caring about you. Is that really what you want for yourself? I can fool you into thinking I care. Even this, we're having a little bit of a fight. I promise you, this is real. I feel very strongly about this. I'll fight with you about this tomorrow and tomorrow. This is a real conversation. I'm not just going to make you feel good and answer your questions and then disappear into a fog of zeros and ones. This is I have a real life and I'm a real person and we're having a real chat. What, you want to be talking to my avatar? This is human, but I think the sad thing, the thing we really have to worry about is that why is it that we don't have enough people for these jobs? And that's because of social priorities. If you look at the distribution of income and you took some of the income that's going to the very wealthy, the very, very wealthy CEOs and distributed some of that down to the potential psychotherapists who could be trained to work with the elderly, to work with the lonely, to work with children, you'd have plenty of money for lonely people. It's our social priorities, it's our social and political decisions that have kept therapy scarce. And then we say, there are no people for these jobs. So, if Amazon didn't want to go into space, but wanted to cure the problem of loneliness or do something for the problem of loneliness, there would be an uptick in the number of scholarships for people trained to address the problem of loneliness, because it is in every country says that it's a national emergency. But what's the answer? It's programming. It's not people.
So I want to...
Mrs. Lincoln, did you like the play?
I want to stay with the theme of friction, Sherry, because we're just slowly emerging, obviously, from a time of incredible friction, right? The pandemic. And I'm curious to hear from you how you think our relationship to technology has changed. Because on the one hand, you could argue that, it was a boon for the providers of digital platforms, right? It has accelerated the adoption of remote work. I think there were situations that were far more convenient because of digital platforms. But there was also a lot of friction on Zoom, for example. And in a strange way, Zoom fostered intimacy, right? It sort of made us more vulnerable. It allowed people to peek into our living rooms, have our children sort of walk into the frame. So how are we emerging from the pandemic, and how has our relationship to technology changed? Are we more empathic beings, having been through this experience, and how do we think about technology now?
I think it's a very complex question, because many things can happen at the same time. On the one hand, Zoom provided a kind of window. Let me talk about my own life. I had a kind of window onto how my students live, because I saw them in their homes. I saw that some of them had homes where they didn't have internet. They had to sit in cars near free Wi-Fi, or they had to sit in parks near free Wi-Fi. I realized what I knew but I hadn't seen, which is the leveling effect of college, which makes everybody look equal when they're not equal. And I think it was a kind of wake-up call for so many people to see what we knew but didn't see and didn't articulate. On the other hand, no matter how intimate Zoom is, it allowed for a strange kind of intimacy. Because just before the program started, for example, and I'm just using an example, both of us were reminded that to give the audience the illusion of eye contact, I'm supposed to look at the camera on my computer, which is a little green light, which means that I can't look at Tim. So in conversations with each other, to give the illusion of connection, we have to look at nothing at all. So those of us who did a lot of trying to relate to each other, as I did trying to relate to my students, I learned that to give them the illusion of intimacy, as I'm trying to do now by looking at the green light, I had to not look at anything at all. Now, the fact that became a kind of gold standard for how to express the greatest degree of honor in showing intimacy by trying to give you the feeling of eye contact. And now I'm going to look at, you on the screen, so I can see your body language and your, what you look like, because you want the human wants to see the other person when they're communicating. But now, of course, it looks like I'm looking down in order to see that. That's kind of crazy that we trained ourselves to not look at each other in order to give the illusion of looking at each other. And yet that became the sort of gold standard. And I think that metaphor of don't look at the person at all, so that technology can translate you as caring about the person, is such a wonderful metaphor for how technology shapes what we experience as intimacy. And I think we end up very confused in this sense about what intimacy is, because after a year of being told that to make my students feel close, I shouldn't look at them, I'm pretty convinced that I need to get back into the classroom and actually look at them in order to feel close to them. And there's a question I know it's not the question time, but a question just leapt out to me that said, don't some human therapists just pretend? They're just there and they're just kind of, they're going through the motions and they don't really care about you. And what about those guys? And I would say this, therapists aren't perfect, and therapists don't all become 1,000% invested in your story, your problem, I'm not trying to make therapists out to be a superhuman race. When you tell a therapist that you're afraid of COVID, you have underlying conditions, you're afraid that you'll never see your child again, that therapist doesn't have to have a super special relationship with you. You know that therapist understands death, children, what it would be like to say goodbye to a child through a screen. That therapist understands the basics of a human condition. So I'm not arguing some, Pollyanna notion of, you know what I mean? Like all therapists are special, or therapists are amazing, or every therapist is like, is involved with you in some kind of crazy intimate way. There are therapists who it's a job, but they have this qualification. They're human. They know what loneliness is. They know if I said that I had underlying conditions and I was afraid of being intubated and saying goodbye to my daughter on a screen, and went through many dark nights in which that kept me up, whether or not they liked me, or whether or not I had a special relationship with them, or whether or not some of the time they were just phoning it in, they would understand that. And that's really all I'm saying. I tell that to a machine and I get some, oh, I hear you back. It is useless. It is useless. And if it makes me feel better, we have degraded what makes us feel better.
Before we, and that, by the way, that was a question that also really stood out for me. That and there's a few more questions coming in that are fantastic, and I'll basically pull from them in a second. Yeah. But I want to close the 30 minutes one-on-one. Yeah,
right. I'm sorry, it just like pops,
Yeah, absolutely, and that's totally fine. But I want to close with one philosophical question, which is really about the end of the anthropocene. So, listening to you, and I would consider myself as well a humanist and a tech humanist, but the argument that we're making is always for the sake of human well-being and flourishing. And of course, we're clearly biased. We're humans. Of course, humanizing is important for us. But aside from that, humanity seems to be a weak argument for humanity. The question is, are we really as important as we think we are? And you could argue that our being so human-centric, that humanism in and of itself is actually the very problem and has led to some of the existential crises that we're facing, such as, most notably, climate change. So isn't it time we get over ourselves and we develop a relationship to other forms of intelligence that grants them dignity without their ability to be human or to feel? So is it time to transcend the notion of being human-centric and the Anthropocene? Wouldn't it be better for us and for the sake of the planet and all life on Earth if we just really got over ourselves?
Well, I've seen, I think I see the problem a little bit differently, is that humanists have not, by any stretch of the imagination, behaved in ways that they say are the humanistic values. Just as people who say they believe in democracy haven't behaved by any stretch of the imagination in ways that follow the democratic credos, or people who say they believe in voting rights don't follow through any stretch of the imagination the things that you need to do if you say you believe in voting rights. So I think that before we hand things over to machines whose values, I think machines will have values that we have no reason to think they will be machine values. This friction-free is one that haunts me, because the friction-free and things that are good for machines and make machines work better have very little to do with the halting, backtracking, frictional, unconscious ways that people find gratification and love and deep connection. So I don't, in the Empathy Diaries, I show example after example. I mean, I try to make my point through a life lived as a humanist among engineers, that when you apply machine values to human life, you apply machine values to human life and you don't end up with anything but a kind of odd fit. I tell funny stories and I tell sad stories. So I'm not looking forward to some utopia where these machine values are somehow going to give some great result, just because they're machine values. And I would first like to see human beings standing up for the things that we say that we believe in. And I just see a great crisis in our standing up for the things that theoretically we believe in. I think we've abandoned, I think humanists have abandoned their own beliefs, under pressure from feeling like, oh, engineers must know, oh, I'm smitten with engineer stuff, they must know. I mean, our culture heroes become, Steve Jobs, Mark Zuckerberg, Tesla, Elon Musk, Bezos. I mean, why are people who somehow are very good at constructing large engineering systems, but who really haven't shown a tremendous gift for thinking about how people should live, what makes people thrive, what human values people need, privacy, democracy, intimacy. I mean, these people don't seem to have a kind of special gift for privacy, democracy, and intimacy, which I see as the kind of golden triangle of what we need, of where we need to place technology to make it really work for us. And yet these become the kind of rock stars of our future. No. So no, I don't accept the premise at all.
I like that. No. For the remaining 7 minutes, let's become practical and actually draw from some more questions from the audience. By the way, if you have questions, Sherry, please submit them, and then I'll do my very best to cover them. Let's become practical, Sherry, and let's assume for a second that it is a lost cause. Because that's what this question here suggests, saying if famous AI engineers already devalue human connection and AI is the technology of the future, where the next multi-billion companies are emerging from, then how, question for you, Sherry, how do we inject empathy in a meaningful way? How would you respond to that?
I suppose I would carve out areas where these AI companies should not tread. Childcare. I mean, unfortunately, these are the areas where they want to tread first. But let me just say that, assuming that AI is just going to be like, so big, but I would try to keep them out of childcare and elder care. It's where they want to go first. I think it's where they should go last. And I think that you could have a very humanistic yet respectful of artificial intelligence conversation about how some money, from all the money they could be making in other areas, to leave this low-hanging fruit alone and leave this in the hands of people. Because when you actually get an AI scientist and say, do you really want to be accompanied in your elder years by a robot and not by a caring person? Very few people raise their hand and say, oh, yeah, just, I want this robot that understands nothing, So I think by carving out areas, early childhood education, a carve out, very bad for young children, a carve out, and then make areas where the damage would be less. So I think that perhaps a conversation about where the least harm could be done. A lot of money to be made, the least harm could be done.
And what's the role of business in all of this as we are reintegrating into workplaces? We are observing, right, that empathy, for example, has become a thing. There's an empathy index. A lot of people are talking and writing about empathy. The same is true for intimacy or vulnerability ever since Brené Brown's very popular TED Talk. Do you see this sort of moving mainstream and the co-opting of these terms? Is that a good thing because more people, it'll enhance visibility for many people? Or yes. Are you worried about the commodification of those concepts?
A lot of people don't know what it means and they make it mean something that serves their particular business purposes, but at least they're talking about it. And then somebody says a very clever thing and an important thing. What I don't like is when empathy means a kind of kumbaya moment. I get what you feel. I get what you feel. I hear you. I hear you. Empathy begins not with, I know how you feel. Empathy begins with, I don't know how you feel. I'm listening and I'm going to take responsibility for not just your problem, but the place that you're in. It's really a very radical position of putting yourself in the place of not knowing. And very few companies want to be in that place of not knowing. They want to be in a place of, I know how you feel, let me help you. I've been divorced, I know how you feel, No, it begins with solitude and a capacity for solitude. It begins with knowing who you are and then being able to say, I know who I am. Who are you? What are your concerns? Let me hear your concerns. So that's something that the more people investigate and talk about, the better. The fact that a lot of foolish things will be said or that some co-optation will happen, the more conversation about this, the better.
Last question for you, Sherry, because we have only 1 minute left before we have to wrap, unfortunately. What gives you hope, as we emerge from the pandemic, that we can still chart a new course, that the cause that you're fighting for, a human relationship, a human use of technology with real empathy is possible?
I get hope from the fact I studied with a great anthropologist in my, I write about this in the Empathy Diaries, named Victor Turner, who developed a concept called liminality, it was about times betwixt and between, sort of when the old rules have broken down, but there really aren't new rules. And in those times, and I think the pandemic was one of them, we're sort of uncertain as to exactly where we are. And I think we're in one of those times where we're sort of searching for new solutions, 3 days a week, 4 days a week, 2 days a week. What's the role of remote? What's the role of AI? We're not sure. And in those times of uncertainty, new anxieties, but also new possibilities for new solutions, new thinking, new creativity, new kinds of mix and match, where to use AI, how to use AI, what's the best, in what situation, even the question you asked me, given the worst scenario, it's going to take over the world, what are the carve-outs? That's not a bad way to start. What are the things that people really, it starts a conversation about, do you want to raise your own children? Do you want robot teachers? Do you want robot minders? Do you want robot babysitters? Do you want a robot taking care of you in 20 years? not so much. Well, then why do you want it for other people? You know, I mean, I think we're at a time when all of these conversations, because it's such a fluid time, can happen. And that was not true when I began my work. And I think it's increasingly true now. And it makes me very optimistic that necessary conversations that have been very hard in the course of my career to have can happen now.
Thank you so much, Sherry. That a more beautiful future is possible by reimagining our relationship to technology. Thank you for your encouraging and hopeful words, for all of your work in the fantastic book, The Empathy Diaries. Thank you all for listening. Thank you for your questions, and enjoy the rest of CogX. See you soon. Bye.